Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the BIAA's panel discussion on Türkiye, or Turkey. My name is Dominick Chilcott. I'm the new BIAA president. BIAA standing, of course, for British Institute at Ankara. And until last July 2022, I was Britain's ambassador to the Turkish Republic. This year is the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the BIAA in Ankara. And over that time, the Institute, which began with a strong focus on archaeology, has broadened its remit and now covers social sciences and lots of contemporary research into Turkey and the Black Sea region. Although, of course, archaeology and the preservation of cultural heritage remains a very key part of what it does. So this panel, taking place in the centenary year, of course, of the foundation of the Turkish Republic, is one way that the BIAA is celebrating its 75th birthday. Now, the remarks tonight and the questions and answers will be on the record. They are going to be recorded. We are not live streaming, but the recording will be available on the BIAA website for people to look at later on. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Koray Ertaş, who is, of course, Turkey's ambassador to the Court of St. James. Koray Bey, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for coming. It's very good of you. One other administrative notice. After the event finishes at around 7 o'clock, I hope that those of you who wish to would like to stay on, chat to the panelists if you wish, have a glass of wine or something else. All that will be available, and we may toast the birthday of the BIAA while we're doing that. Now, to discuss this complex set of issues, we have a most distinguished panel of speakers whom I would like to introduce, and maybe I'll just do it, not in the order in which they will speak, but in the order of proximity to me here. So the first one is Ambassador Selim Yenel, who entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1979, had a glittering career which included postings to the OECD in Paris, to Kabul, in contrast to Paris, to New York, to the Turkish delegation to the European Union, and to Vienna as ambassador, and then back to be the Deputy Undersecretary and then Secretary General for European Union Affairs in Ankara. He retired, and after retiring, has become the president of maybe Turkey's preeminent think tank, the Global Relations Forum. Yaprak Gürsoy, Professor Yaprak Gürsoy, sitting next to him, is Professor of European Politics and the Chair of Contemporary Turkish Studies at the London School of Economics. She's worked on Turkish civil-military relations, foreign policy, the Europeanization, and Anglo-Turkish relations. And she has publications which include Reconsidering Britain's Soft Power, Lessons from the Perceptions of the Turkish Political Elite, and Emotions and Narratives of the Spirit of Gallipoli, Turkey's Collective Identity and Status in International Relations. Professor Dilek Barlas has been a professor of history at Koç University since 1993. Congratulations. She's the author of books such as Statism and Diplomacy in Turkey, 1929 to 1939, Economic and Foreign Policy Strategies in an Uncertain World, Turkey in the Mediterranean during the interwar era. She's also one of the editors of a book which is close to our hearts in the BIAA, which is From Enemies to Allies, Turkey and Britain, 1918 to 1960. Professor Barlas has many articles published in international journals on Balkan and Mediterranean history, and between 2008 and 2014 she was Turkey's representative on the Standing Committee for the Humanities at the European Science Foundation. And at the end of the line of speakers is Dr. Dimitar Bechev, who's a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, where he focuses on Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. He's also a lecturer at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. Dr. Bechev is the author of Turkey under Erdogan, which was published only last year and is selling well, I gather. He's also written the Historical Dictionary of North Macedonia and a book called Rival Power, Russia in Southeast Europe, as well as being the co-editor of Russia Rising, Putin's Foreign Policy in the Middle East and North Africa. He's published numerous academic articles and policy reports. His past positions include lecturer at the University of South Carolina at Chapel Hill and senior policy fellow, head of the Sofia office at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And most recently, he was the guest editor of a special issue of Uluslararası İlişkiler Dergisi on Russia-Turkey relations. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give your panel a very warm welcome. And we will start with our first speaker, Professor Dilek Barlas.
Now, well, I gave this title. I'm going to talk in general about Turkish foreign policy in the 20th century. I gave the title of Waves of Change because Turkish foreign policy from the 1923 on did not change in a linear way, or it had, I would rather call it, had different periods and different strategies. This is what I am going to talk today. I, in general, divided the 20th century in different periods, and we will see how this, the foreign policy changes from one period to another. Yeah, okay. Well, we all know, of course, I don't need to explain this, that Turkey was recognized as a new nation state with the Treaty of Lausanne. But this did not mean that the Lausanne Treaty resolved everything. There were still some economic problems that we won't discuss here. But diplomatically, Turkey still had some problems with Britain and France, which were not resolved. In general, when Turkey was established in the 1920s, and it continued in the 1930s, the first half of the 1930s, it tried to have a good relationship with the neighboring countries, with the Balkan countries, but also with the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union was in the 1930s, the Soviet Union was the country which gave, the only country which gave loan to Turkey without any interest. And, you know, the relations continued in a good way, we can say, until the end of the Second World War. Then when we come to the 1930s, in the 1920s, since Turkey was a new nation state, I will say that it didn't have clear foreign policy strategy. It developed its foreign policy strategy rather after the world economic crisis of 1929, because it affected Turkey and its Balkan neighbor countries in the same way. And in addition to that, there was a military presence on the Dodecanic island of Italy that Turkey was very much concerned. In fact, in 1933, Mussolini made his well-known declaration, the Four-Power Pact, saying that only with the cooperation of four great powers, of course, Italy, Germany, France, and Britain, that peace can come to Europe. Then, as a reaction, Balkan countries collaborated, except Bulgaria, also Albania, as being a small country, they cooperated to form a Balkan Entente. As you see, this being in good terms with the neighboring countries was the essential policy of Turkey in the 1930s, but also with the Soviet Union. How about Germany? Germany, as you know, Nazis came to power in 1933, and with the coming of the Nazis to power, Germany started having a lot of influence, not only on Turkey, on other Balkan countries also, signing barter treaties. With this, it means change of goods, since there was a lack of foreign money, in Turkey and other countries. Therefore, it had, we can say that Germany rather had a more than political economic influence in these countries. Of course, there are always exceptions, and it will change during the war. How about Britain? As you see here, the picture of Edward VIII coming with, in fact, this is in front of Dolmabahce, I think. Then Turkish-British relations improved in the second half of the 1930s because of the increasing threat of war, and also mainly after the Italian invasion of Abyssinia or Ethiopia. Then Britain tried to be more understanding, I will say, towards Turkey, and accepted by the Montreux Treaty the Turkish control over the Straits. Then for the first time in 1939, this is very important, Turkey entered into an alliance treaty with Britain and France. Then I will say that in this period, in the interwar period, Turkey rather followed an autonomous policy, and as we know, it followed a neutrality policy during the Second World War, not participating in the war. Then we come to the main question, why did Turkey join the Western Bloc? This is, of course, most of us know that Turkey became member of NATO in 1952, but before that, as I mentioned, the first alliance with the Western European countries was in 1939, and in 1947, the Truman Doctrine was accepted by Turkey. Then, I here put three reasons. In fact, they are all related. I think the main, there are many different reasons, but as today, the main concern of Turkey was the need for funds to carry out development plans, and of course to participate in future aid programs. This was the basic, I think, concern of Turkey at that time. Of course, there was security issue, but also there are question marks there if Turkey really used security issues to gain aid, to have aid, or where really security issues is the main concern. Well, I already said that Turkey became member of NATO in 1952. But we know that Britain objected the participation of Turkey, the membership of Turkey into NATO. Then there was one, in fact, condition. They said if Turkey will preserves, in fact, the British interest in the Middle East, and this will lead to the foundation of the Baghdad Pact in 1955, that Turkey accepted. And very interestingly here, Turkey even during one of the meetings after the Suez Canal issue, persuaded others not to eject Britain from the pact because, other countries oppose this. Therefore, we can see that in the 1950s, there was this, Turkey tried really to be a loyal member of the Western Pact, and at the same time had negative attitudes toward the non-alignment movement, in fact, which took for the first time in Bandung in 1955. Well, here, of course, we have to talk about the European Union. At that time, European, the name was not European Union, as you know. Ankara first became, in fact, Turkey and Greece together in the early 1960s became associate members of the European Union. And even in the beginning, in the 1960s, all political parties and economic elite supported this membership. And from the side of Europe, there was, in fact, they did not emphasize really, cultural or religious differences between Turkey and the others. Then there was not this negative attitude, I will say, towards Turkey. But it started changing in the 1970s with the economic crisis, and Turkey was not able to compete with the members of the EC. And in fact, Erbakan, even someone like Erbakan, started defining EU like a Christian club. And as we know, in 1980, there was a military coup, and this changed relations between Turkey and the European Union. But the interesting point here, Özal, who came to power after 1983, ANAP, and Özal applied for full membership for Turkey in 1987 to become a member of the European Union. I think not only for political reasons, also for economic reasons, it was not accepted, as we know. Well, there was we have to mention, of course, Cyprus here in this, in the 1960s and, of course, 70s. You know that in 1960, Turkey, there was a treaty of guarantee between Cyprus, Britain, Greece, and Turkey. And in the case of signing this treaty, in the case of joint action, if the joint action was not possible in the case of a threat, then each of the three guaranteeing parties has the right to take action. In fact, this is what the Ecevit government used in 1974 when intervening into Cyprus. But I have to mention here that Turkey's negative attitude towards the non-alignment movement had a result, I don't know, bad or in fact received a big negative reaction from the part of Arab countries and other countries which were members of the non-alignment movement, not giving support to Turkey in the case of Cyprus. When this started to change in the 1960s, because in general around the world, as you know, there were independence movement became stronger, even non-alignment movement maybe became stronger, and Demirel, in a sense, wanted to change this bad image of Turkey in the non-aligned countries, not only for political reasons, not only to have support when there were issues such as Cyprus, but also, to develop economic cooperation and trade. In the 1960s and 70s, there were also interesting change. Like before now, the relations had started developing with the Soviet Union, and I will even say that this is what we are doing with a colleague, in fact, Şuhnaz Yılmaz, that we are working now on this paper, that even it started in 1957, but of course we have to prove that. In 1965, a Soviet delegation headed by Podgorny came to Turkey, and there was also now close economic relations with the Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq and Iran. Then in the 1980s, when we come to the 1980s, then traditional policy of seeking additional aid, stressing Turkey's strategic, contribution to the West events continued. But at the same time, mainly at the Özal period, they wanted to develop economic relations with the Middle Eastern countries. And Özal, as we know, aimed to have aid not only from the United States, but also from EU. I'm coming to the end. In the 1990s, when we come to the 1990s, I will say that Turkey's Middle Eastern policy was similar to the 1950s, in the sense that Turkey always took part in a loyal way with the Western bloc against, neighboring Middle Eastern countries such as supporting sanctions and allied military operation against Iraq. But at the same time, economic cooperation was important, was very much emphasized by Özal government, and also even in the relations with, as you see here, with Russia now after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then, if you want to conclude, therefore, I divided into, as I said, different period, the Turkish foreign policy. In the interwar period, we can say that Turkey followed kind of autonomous policy. If you have questions, I can discuss much more in detail at the time as a foreign policy. But in the Second World War, Turkey did not participate in the war. Then from 1945 to 1960, there were strong efforts to be part of the Western Bloc. I gave examples. But in the 1960s and 70s, Turkey realized rather that it was its own interest to have multipolar foreign policy. And the 1980s and 90s, now economic concerns became the priority. And of course, today, probably, the people who will discuss maybe 21st century, then they will mention if there's a continuation or the break from the 20th century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Barlas. I'd now like to invite Dr. Dimitar Bechev to take the floor. And thank you for giving us such a good historical foundation for our discussion.
Well, before I start, let me extend my warmest gratitude to Ambassador Chilcott and to the British Institute in Ankara for organizing this timely event. The centennial of the Republic is a big highlight. The legacy of people who built the Republic is still with us. I happen to be the only non-Turk on the panel, but I acknowledge as well, and I'm happy to see all the friends and colleagues here, and it's good to reflect on the 100 years. In many ways, we see a lot of continuities, and I'm thankful to Professor Barlas bringing up many of those episodes and trends in history that have echoes in the present. I don't have a presentation, and I'll limit myself to making 3 points, as we are taught at school, to make it succinct. And I suspect you want to discuss the events of the day, which is Gaza, Israel, Palestine. I won't touch on it, and I'll leave for the other panelists, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of back and forth in the Q&A. And my first point will be about the other war, the one in Ukraine, which I think very much reshapes political order in Europe and in Turkey's neighborhood more broadly. Secondly, I want to say a few words about Turkish foreign policy and how Turkey sees itself in international and regional order. And finally, and that's why I connect to Professor Barlas, a few words about the enduring connection between Turkey and the West, despite all the tangled history and tensions that we've seen over the past 2 decades. So how about Ukraine? Well, I'm not surprised where Turkey stands on Ukraine. I mean, a lot of people, when Russia mounted the full-scale invasion on the 24th of February, considered that to be a turning point in Ankara's attitude to Putin, to Moscow. But what we've seen is continuity. A good friend of mine, a colleague at Oxford, Galip Dalai, summed it up very nicely, and much better than I have ever dreamt of doing it. He said, Turkey's policy is to be pro-Ukraine without being anti-Russia. And I think that this holds, this definition. And come to think of it, there's the same reaction Turkey had to the war in Georgia in 2008. We actually tried to support Georgia. It's a friendly country. Turkey never had any problems with Georgia. Even in the worst days with neighboring tensions in the 90s, Georgia was one of the few neighbors that was on good terms. But at the same time, it sought conciliation and tried to launch a regional cooperation dialogue in Southern Caucasus, not with huge success, I must say, but there's the same attitude to try to find a balance. Fast forward Crimea, 2014, Crimea gets annexed. And it's a big event for Turkey. Just look at the map where Crimea stands and geopolitical implications. Not to mention the Tatars, the diaspora, and it's a whole different discussion for us. We don't have the time to engage. But what did Turkey do? Turkey condemned annexation. It acknowledged the Tatar leadership, gave a state declaration to Karamoğlu, the Tatar leader, but it refused to join the Western sanctions against Russia. In fact, it deepened some of the cooperation initiatives. The extreme pipeline became an agenda item. So again, you see the balance. But of course, Turkey didn't block any sanctions either or didn't block any NATO policy, for example, on forward deployment. And it's the same now, despite the scale being different with Ukraine. In fact, I think that Turkey avoided the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario would have been Russia being victorious, taking Kiev, taking the Black Sea littoral. Imagine the implications if the Russians were in Odessa and Ukraine didn't have any sea access. It would have been a very bad scenario for Turkey. But since Ukraine managed to stop the onslaught with Western help, and obviously Britain has played a huge role, Turkey was in a much better shape to first try to be the mediator in the early days, hosting several rounds of negotiations, but also trying to provide a back channel to the Russians. I mean, the flights are flying to Istanbul, lots of people moved there. If you go to Kadıköy these days, you're likely to hear Russian spoken here and there. Also, Turkey has profited from the energy trade. Now it's one of the big customers for Russian crude oil. So overall, it could have been much, much worse for Turkey and the implications. And energy prices were stabilized as well. And Turkey has navigated this crisis relatively well, I'd say. It doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. It's a protracted conflict, and I can see Turkey trying to support the Ukrainians, but up to a certain level, and trying to keep channels open to Russia, because remember, Russia is not just in Crimea, it's not just in Ukraine, it's also in Armenia next door, despite whatever happened in Karabakh, it's at Turkey's border. It's also in Syria, it's also in Libya, and Turkey has had to deal with Russia and has learned how to cooperate, but also fight if need be. People often forget that over those, 9 years, Turkey is the only NATO member that has actually fought the Russians. First, 2015 in Syria, whatever is the story behind the downing of the Russian plane. Secondly, in Libya, through a proxy conflict, because Wagner was deployed there. And also, again, in Syria, in Idlib, where Turkey managed to dictate the terms, and Putin was prepared, after ignoring Erdogan, to re-engage. So Turkey has managed to find a way how to strike a balance to diplomacy, but also the use of force vis-à-vis Russia to contain and to engage. So that's my main point. This is, we need to understand Turkish policy on the Ukrainian conflict, and I'm happy to look at the crystal ball in the Q&A and think, where is that going to? And I'm curious to listen to other panelists, what they think about it, how sustainable and what the risks are. I guess the bigger point is that Turkey is no longer just a junior partner in the West. I think that's a consensus on this one. It sees itself as a self-standing player, independent power that is able to both be in the same boat with the main Western powers, notably the United States. I mean, whatever you think about Turkish-US relations, and they have deteriorated a lot for reasons we'll probably discuss at some point in this panel. But we're on the upswing right now. Things have been improving marginally. Also with others, UK-Turkish relations are in a fairly good shape. But also Turkey has developed the link to Russia. It has developed a link to China as well, with China being an economic actor. And you could say this is the outlook of people who have been running Turkey for the past 20 years, the AKP. There is a grain of truth to it. I remember when Ibrahim Kalın was a fellow think tanker before he moved to government, we used to discuss it, and he does believe that we are moving into a post-Western world of multiple powers, so Turkey is one regional power amongst others. But I would say that it's not just this side of the political spectrum. In a hypothetical scenario where actually Turkey would have been governed by the Republican People's Party, I mean, we're not going there, obviously, but think about a Kılıçdaroğlu presidency. I don't think there would have been a major change in policy. Maybe marginally, maybe with the EU, but not in the big picture. Turkey would have been still projecting its influence, using also military power if need be, in the neighborhood, and trying to gain strategic autonomy and being able to be its own independent center of power. And that's likely to remain the case going forward, whatever future brings us. Also, this is not a story that starts with the AKP. I think the main factor there is the end of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, the Soviet threat was removed. Turkey felt much safer. Also, it felt insecure because of regional conflicts, but this main concern was removed. Gained buffer states in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, in Central Asia, built this distance from the Russians, and this changed the geopolitical outlook of Turkey. And again, other things happened with Arab Spring and domestic change in Turkey, but I think that's the main turning point, the early 90s. And it's been building up ever since that we live in a different world. So that's my second point. My third point, I think very often my colleagues in the business of foreign policy analysis go too far, throwing the baby with the bathwater. Because sometimes economic and social data speak for itself. I mean, who remains the main export partner of Turkey? Still the European Union, which is the main destination of foreign direct investment. Despite the rise of trade relations with the Middle East, with Sub-Saharan Africa, with China, of course, on the import side, still the EU is the main driver of change. And it's not for nothing that a standard policy, and I'm sure Ambassador Yenel has things to say there, a standard demand for Turkey now is to update the customs union, to add depth to it, because Turkey needs to develop economically, and this is the driver of change. That has been the case since the 1990s, if not before, the integration and attachment to the European economy. Secondly, society. I mean, look around in any big European country, maybe not as much the UK, but elsewhere. You have people of Turkish origin who have done very well, and they are in politics, they're in culture, they're in business. That's very much the case in continental Europe. So this connection is pretty strong. I'm happy to say that's also the case in my country, Bulgaria. It's a different case, of course. It's not diaspora. It's like local population. But you go to the European Parliament, you'll see a few members of European Parliament who are ethnic Turks from Bulgaria. So this is another bond that is lasting and putting it together. You can think of other issues, energy security, climate change. I mean, Turkey will be really affected by what the EU does with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It will have to adopt some of the EU's legislation. And lastly, NATO. And this is where UK becomes relevant. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey can project influence, can be independent diplomatically, but there is a security guarantee, which provides a different environment for Turkey. So, of course, I know Turkish policymakers have doubts how firm is the guarantee, and there were conversations around Syria why the NATO member states were not there for Turkey. But in a hypothetical scenario, we actually have a direct challenge by Russia against Turkey. NATO Article 5 is still relevant. So this is my last point, that Turkey still, despite the tensions, despite the frictions, those bridges haven't been burnt. And that's something in our mutual interest to maybe not develop, because it's difficult, we have to recognize constraints politically, but to try to preserve as much as possible. And I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, that's probably very close to the British position on Turkey these days. So I'll stop here.
Dr. Bechev, thank you very much indeed. That was tremendous. Now turn to Professor Yaprak Gürsoy to give her presentation.
If you can give me a second to set up. Okay, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation either, but I have these notes, so I feel like now I'm going to start directing an orchestra. Well, thank you very much to the British Institute for organizing this event, and for those of you who are in the audience for coming. What I'm going to do in my 13 minutes is to provide an overview of the interaction between domestic issues and foreign policy, especially vis-à-vis the West. So the question that I will try to answer is which domestic issues or themes were influenced by foreign policy and were then influenced by developments in international relations. So I'm not going to provide a chronological overview. What I'm going to do instead is to provide a thematic overview. So I identified 4 key themes that would summarize, in some respects, Turkish foreign policy for its 100 years. So these themes are related to one another, and perhaps the first 2 are more obvious than the latter 2. So the first 2 are democratization, human rights, and civil-military relations. The second one is economic crisis, or the economy in general. And the third, the less obvious one, is migration, both outward and inward migration. And then the fourth one is public opinion, which is a constant, I would say, behind the scenes. So let me now provide a quick overview of each of these themes. Let's start with democratization. I guess this is the most obvious one. We can start looking at the impact of the Turkish political regime on its foreign policy relations from the first transition to democracy or multi-party regime, which is usually attributed to the Cold War, to the start of the Cold War, and Turkey's desire to be part of the West. Then we have coups, as we all know, in 1960, in 1971, and in 1980. And these coups can be understood as their main aims being part of the, or continue to maintain the Turkey's alliance with the West. So they were, in a way, against autocracy, to create some sort of democratic regime, or to continue with that sort of democratic regime. And also they were definitely against the rise of the left. Since 1980, and after the Cold War, we are witnessing the failure to deepen democracy and protect human rights, and this impacting relations with the West, and especially the US and the EU. Here, I think we need to focus specifically on the Kurdish issue as well, or mention it as a specific point, as Turkey's approach to the Kurdish issue has complicated relations with the West, but not only with the West, also with its neighbors, more recently in Syria and also in Iraq. There are even arguments by some that would say that if Turkey were able to resolve its Kurdish issue and accommodate for Kurdish demands on a more democratic platform, relations with the West would be resolved. Now, the second theme that I would like to talk about is the economic theme, the economy and crisis. So as Professor Barlas has explained, the need for economic aid, loans and foreign direct investment from the 1930s onwards have actually impacted relations with the West. So it became a necessity to have some sort of economic ties or relations with the West, and also political ones with Washington and European capitals. Economic crisis in the 1970s and the transition to a market economy in the 1980s after the coup anchored relations with the West, and it paved in the 1990s to the Customs Union Agreement. In general, though, we can say that EU accession negotiations in the early 2000s onwards led to economic reforms. So there's again a direct interaction between the economy and foreign relations. In 2001, the financial crisis led to the collapse of the banking sector and high inflation. This crisis prompted a series of economic reforms and cooperation with international organizations such as the IMF. And today, we are also facing economic difficulties. There's high inflation and a decline in the value of the lira. Turkey is looking for international funds from the West, but also Middle Eastern capitals. Again, as Professor Barlas said, this happens in the 1980s as well. So there were relations with the Middle East and Gulf states for funds. But today, particularly interesting are relations with Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. So Turkish foreign policy with certain countries, with certain international organizations, can be read or understood from the theme or within the theme of economy and crisis. Now, the third theme, migration, is perhaps less obvious, like I said. It is a relatively popular topic since the past few years and decades. And we tend to pay attention to migration today more than we used to in the past. Of course, in Turkey's case, this is mostly related to the influx of refugees. Right now, according to official statistics, there are around 5 million foreign nationals in Turkey, and around 4 million of them are Syrians. But we have an increasing number of other foreign nationals coming into Turkey. With the war in Ukraine, for instance, in 2022, last year, a quarter of the immigrants were from Russia. So the policy is managing this influx, led perhaps to disappointment and growing xenophobia in Turkey against foreign nationals. This is, of course, related to economy as well, because local population is against the foreign nationals or immigrants in terms of economic resources. So there is a bit of a conflict there as a result of that. But this also partly, this relates to Turkish national identity and perhaps a deeper sense of collective identity vis-à-vis Eastern neighbors. And then we have, of course, Turkey-EU trade deal, which was signed in March 2016, which is directly related to migration. But it's not only about the influx of refugees. More recently, we are talking about brain drain and the outflow of Turkish people. So this recent migration is related to highly educated people moving especially to Western cities and Western countries. Every year since 2016, according to, again, official statistics, we don't have the exact numbers, but at least 70,000 Turkish people emigrated to other countries. 2015 and 2022 were peak years, with nearly 150,000 people leaving. Most of those who migrate are below the age of 35. So we are losing the young, basically. And this is related to the economy, as well as prospects for living standards. So we know that highly educated, for instance, researchers, people in academia are leaving, but we don't necessarily have the numbers. We know that doctors are leaving by thousands, but we don't necessarily have the statistics. These are new issues, perhaps, but migration is not that new in the sense that it has been an important theme since the end of the Second World War. So Turkish citizens moving to Germany or Western countries, Kurds having their own communities in many European cities, I would say have impacted Turkey's relations with European countries. So in the recent elections, there were 3.5 million people who could vote in the general elections. We know that there's much more than those who can vote because these are only people who registered. So perhaps there are around 10 to 11 million Turkish people living outside of Turkey's borders. So why is this important? This is important because the diaspora's influence on Turkish foreign relations, and it's a very dynamic relationship. In some countries, diaspora are pressuring governments of their countries, and so there's indirect influence. There's also indirect influence in the sense that in Western countries, there's xenophobia against the Turks. So among far-right and populist groups, we can see this anti-Turkish Islamophobic attitude impacting Turkey's relations, especially in countries where right-wing governments are in power or threatened by these far-right political parties. The best example of this phenomenon would be the 2017 Turkey-Netherlands crisis, where Turkish officials tried to hold a referendum campaign in Netherlands, and then they were expelled and barred from entering the country. Now, the final theme is public opinion, which is usually forgotten because there is, in general, in foreign policy analysis, there would be the belief that general public perceptions are impacted by political leaders, not the other way around. But as someone who believes in more structural analysis than personal accounts of a certain phenomenon, I would say that public perceptions of foreign countries are influencing how political leaders are approaching issues. At least they provide certain limits which cannot be crossed by political leaders who want to get re-elected. And public opinion provides a general interpretation of Turkish foreign policy, the ebbs and flows of relations with the West and with other countries, and not necessarily direct or imminent, like why did Turkey behave this way in this situation? But perhaps we cannot find the answer from public opinion surveys. But public opinion surveys show that the West is perceived as a threat in general by the majority of the Turkish public. But there's also a desire to be a part of the West, for instance, to become a member of the European Union. So there is this demand to be recognized as an equal partner to the West. And I think Dr. Bechev mentioned this being an important desire, an important goal. So being respected or recognized by the West is an important goal. How do you achieve that? If that's what public opinion wants, as a political leader, how would you achieve that? Sometimes you go against the West, assert independence, project power in the neighborhood, and this can be interpreted as a desire to establish equality. So you behave in this way to assert the fact that you are an equal country in the international community. But sometimes you go with the West to be part of the alliance, never really get out of NATO, of course, and you do that to be accepted as a partner. So there you go, in a nutshell, why Turkey's foreign policy can be summarized as a desire to be an equal partner to the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Gürsoy. And our final speaker this evening for these initial interventions is Ambassador Selim Yenel.
Well, good evening, and congratulations for the Institute. And I'd like to thank Sir Dominick for, inviting me here. I feel very privileged and flattered. The title you're seeing here is Turkey in the West. It's my colleague who was helping me with making this PowerPoint, because I can't do it. It was actually Turkey and the West, but she inadvertently said in the West. And I kept it because for the last 100 years, we think that we were in the West. Now, to talk about the future of Turkish foreign policy or Turkey itself, we have to go back in history, but not too far in history, don't worry. I won't be using the time in that sense. But just to go into the Turkish psyche, why are we thinking the way we are thinking right now? During the Ottoman Empire, the relations with the West could be described as we were the enemy, a rival, a competitor, and sometimes an ally. A quite different kind of mixture. But when the Republic was established and the Ottoman Empire crumbled, Atatürk decidedly turned towards the West and said that we will become part of the West. So we initiated Western-inspired reforms. And during the years until the end of the Cold War, we tried to become part of all the Western institutions you've seen over there. OECD, NATO, Council of Europe, these have been mentioned already. And of course, attempts to join the EU. But not only that, Eurovision contest, whatever, the UEFA, everything that was related to the West was very, interested for us, and we just wanted to be part of it. Now, everything changed. I'm jumping very quickly because I want to go into the future. The end of the Cold War changed so much for us. Because until then, Turkey was member of many institutions, and Turkey thought that it was accepted as part of the family of the West. But there was a rude awakening after the Cold War ended, because the need for Turkey diminished. There was no Soviet threat anymore, and the threat had gone, so Turkey was seen in a different light. Nevertheless, Turkey didn't wake up immediately. Turkey applied for membership, for EU membership, but it had made a mistake previously, because in the 70s, when the Cyprus issue, the Cyprus question came about, after that happened, Greece applied for EU membership, while we didn't. And that has been the fatal mistake of our foreign policy, which we still suffer from that. And I think it was the biggest mistake we made. If we hadn't, we would be in a very different position right now. So we applied for membership only in 1987. And we had to wait for 2 years for the EU to come up with an answer. And of course, it was the usual EU answer, something in the middle. That Turkey was not ready, the EU was not ready, that we could, work on something else, which was the customs union. So Turkey was waiting, but at the same time, as Europe was changing, and the former communist countries were jumping the queue. They became applicants, candidates, and if you might remember, the Copenhagen criteria was created specifically for them. Only at that time it was Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. And then it was applied for the rest. But mind you, those countries didn't apply for membership before the Copenhagen criteria. The EU had decided that they would be brought back into the European family. We never had that. And so in 1997 at the Luxembourg European Council, these countries were given a perspective for EU membership, while Turkey was left aside. And that was a wake-up call for us. What are we going to do? How are we going to reestablish ourselves with the West? Are we moving away from the West? Is the West moving us away? So we made a lot of efforts, and finally, and I'm jumping again, we can go into the details in the Q&A, we finally was able to start accession talks. Now, when you start accession talks, you usually end them. That's the idea. But for us, of course, it's a different picture. As soon as we started accession talks, we thought that, this is it, that we'll finally find a way to get closer and closer. But no, two essential things happened. Chancellor Merkel became the Chancellor of Germany, and Sarkozy became the President of France. Those two characters made it very, very difficult for us to be part of the EU. especially Mr. Sarkozy, has said that, Turkey is a very important country. We think that it's very significant. It's a region, but it's not a European country. It has no place in the EU. Chancellor Merkel, characteristically, was in the middle ground. She said, "Pacta sunt servanda," if Turkey fulfills the criteria, then Turkey could join. And of course, she knew that it wouldn't be able to do it, because at that time, we can talk about Cyprus as well, but Cyprus, at least the southern part, became a member of the EU. And so we had not only Greece, but now Cyprus as a bloc towards Turkish accession, amongst others. At the same time, less and less dialogue with Turkey. Since 2004, Turkey was not invited to high-level meetings, summits, etc., etc. And then we had our own hubris. When the AKP government came into power, for the first 5 or 6 years, Turkey was developing economically, making a lot of progress, and also a lot of reforms. We have to accept that the EU forced Turkey to make more and more reforms. And so the rule of law, fundamental freedoms were there. A lot of investment towards Turkey, Turkey opening up to the world. The world had changed, of course, because the two blocs had gone, and Turkey had more muscle now, as we have just discussed. It was becoming more and more of a regional power. It opened up embassies all around the world. When I joined the ministry, we had about 12 embassies in Africa, and now we have almost 2 embassies. Two countries that we don't have embassies. So we have about 46 or 47 embassies in Africa. We're opening up, or we haven't opened up, all over Latin America, Asia. So I think we are the number 5 country that has so many embassies or representations in the world. So this gave us some kind of hubris as well, that we were becoming more regional power, and the distance between the EU and Turkey was growing. And not only that, but we saw a more different kind of foreign policy emerging, a personal and ideological foreign policy. And that's how Turkey approached the Middle East, its surroundings, and it thought that it could actually influence a lot of those countries. And in the end, what did we see? We saw that Turkey was not making that much progress. But something happened, the migration crisis. Migration crisis because of the Arab popular movements. I never use the word Arab Spring. It was a popular movement in certain countries, and of course, we saw the winter come. And the migration crisis happened after Syria embroiled in the civil war, and we had to face the number of migrants that was just described. And in 2015, Chancellor Merkel had said that Germany, or the EU, could manage 1 million or so Syrians. And then there was a big wave of Syrians leaving Turkey from Greece towards European countries. And of course, that was a big crisis for many countries in the EU. So all of a sudden, they remembered Turkey. And they asked Turkey to help the EU in that respect. And that's when we had our migration deal. The migration deal is not only about migration, it was about to set the record straight, to put our relations back on track, about accession, about visas, about customs union, etc., etc. So we wanted to re-establish our relationship with the EU through the migration crisis. But unfortunately, the coup happened, the so-called coup, whatever you might call it, in 2016. And after that, our relations with the EU just suffered because of going back on the reforms, backsliding as the EU likes to say, fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, rule of law, it all went back. All the reforms that have been made because of the EU, inspired by the EU, have gone back. And so the relationship with the EU suffered. And they set conditions for even upgrading the customs union, for visa, and I'm not going to even talk about accession talks. That was put, in a freezer. At that time, Turkey was already, talked about it. I think Dimitar mentioned our relationship with Russia. We bought the S-400s, another fatal mistake. At that time, Turkey was already trying to, be in the process of the F-35 fighter jets. But, and this is something that related to NATO. And there was a Turkish company that was producing more than 750 parts of that plane. But somehow Turkey bought the S-400s, which it has not used at all. And of course, the relations with NATO suffered. And so we have not been able to, we were just kicked out of the F-35s. And as a consolation prize, we said that, let's try to get the F-16s, upgrade them. Now, at that time, again, because of the personal and ideological way in which we pursued our foreign policy, we became more and more lonely. And there was this kind of definition called splendid loneliness at that time was said. Fortunately, Turkey found out that this is not going to work and had backtracked from all these policies. And we've seen that since the late 2020. Turkey has tried to mend fences with its neighbors, tried to bring back the relations. And it has, although it has criticized very heavily Greece, the leaders of Greece, Israel, Egypt, saying that they would never talk to them, or at least not even sit on the same table at dinner. Those are the things that we've witnessed. But now, and Saudi Arabia, if you might remember, it was, the crown prince was called the killer. But not only Turkey, but the world has made, has mended fences with Saudi Arabia. And so did Turkey. Turkey is now much closer to Israel, to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. It has learned from its mistakes and it is returning back to its original foreign policies. Now, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, Dimitar has mentioned that, so I'll just pass that over. So, my final point is these questions. Is Turkey reliable as a partner? Is Turkey part of the West? And where will Turkey be in a fragmented international order? Because the world is changing, and we're seeing more and more violence instead of diplomacy. Look at what has happened in Ukraine, and not only Ukraine and the Middle East, but also with regard to what has been happening in Karabakh. For 30 years, the Minsk group couldn't solve this. And so Azerbaijan finally saw an opportunity and used its forces and got back Karabakh. With Hamas, we're seeing Hamas now using force to gain its objectives. You might find it horrendous, hideous, vicious, but it's using violence to get its means. And diplomacy is now suffering. So I think that we need to work more and more on diplomacy, bring it back. And I think that the way to do it is to get back Turkey into the West. For that to happen, Turkey has to change. Turkey has to bring back its reforms again, the rule of law, of course, fundamental freedoms. But again, it has to be acknowledged by the West. It should not be pushed away as it was. The Turkish psyche is geared towards the West. It has been so far, it has been like that for years and years, for decades. And it cannot change. Sometimes we criticize the West. Of course, when you ask the public opinion, sometimes the West is seen as the enemy. So you might say that we've gone full circle after 100 years, but I think that we can change that. At least we should try to change that. So I'll end here and try to answer your questions. Thank you.
Selim, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our speakers. They were terrific opening remarks. I'm going to throw the floor open. If I'm going to use the chairman's privilege, though, to ask His Excellency the Turkish Ambassador if he'd like to make some comments on what he's just heard.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this lively debate. I actually personally learned a lot from these academic readings as a practitioner. I also agree that people in the West quickly jumps into conclusions while seeing separate, different foreign policy actions of Turkey. But if you read in a context, like two our Turkish professors did, it is actually not naive strategy or a surprising step on the part of Turkey. For example, when Turkey said no to Finland and Sweden, people just jump into conclusion and say that, well, because Turkey is doing business with the Russians and Putin and President Erdogan are good buddies, which is not the case because, as you know, we just decoupled the two, and we have proven that it has nothing to do with NATO, it has nothing to do with Russia. It's a bilateral issue between us and the Swedes about an issue of terrorism, which is so important for our own national security. So I can actually give many other examples. Professor Yaprak gave some themes, and when we are reading a foreign policy, I guess it's valid for every nation. A foreign policy is governed by geopolitics, geography, and also national interest. Of course, there are ideals as well, but there's a strong presence between these different teams. So if you look, dear professor's presentation, it is not only during this government, but throughout the entire history of the Turkish Republic in these 100 years. There are times that we have been very close with the West, and there are times that we have been trying to follow an independent foreign policy. Because it's, again, national interests and geopolitics that were forcing the leaders of the country to try to choose the best option for their nation. This is that easy. During the Cold War, for example, it was so easy for us to take foreign policy decisions because the geopolitical landscape was rather fixed. The only issue that we were focusing, other than the Western agenda, was the Cyprus issue. But other than this, it was quite easy for us. NATO was providing a security umbrella for Turkey, and Turkey was providing a huge asset for the larger Western interests in this volatile region. But after the Cold War, especially after the initial positive 10 years, the whole international system has moved to be in a vacuum. So we try to find our own way using our connections historically and geographically with different countries, different partners. There were definitely ups and downs, but if you look to the last 2 decades of the Turkish foreign policy, it is actually governed by the same actors. So the actors are changing the policy in line with the national interests of the country. But if it doesn't work, we are able to change the policy options in a realistic manner and try to take opposite steps just for the good of the country. And while we are doing this, if you look to this 100th century again, the relationship with the West is not only related to economy. Yes, economy is a very important portion of it, but the Republic of Turkey was not born out of a sudden. It's a continuation of an age-old empire. And the last 100th century of the Ottoman Empire is actually marked by Westernization efforts. So I agree that this is deeply engraved in our social psyche. It's not that Turks are feeling themselves anti-West or pro-European, but whatever you say, geographically, culturally, politically, economically, it's a European power, regardless of its relationship with the EU. And today, if you look at our relationship with NATO, for example, Turkey is the 5th largest contributor to the operations, 8th largest contributor to the general budget. We are hosting the Land Command. Imagine the Navy Command is in Britain here, and the Land Command is in Turkey. So it's a staunch ally of NATO. But when we are having difficulties with our Western allies, and when the choices of some of our allies are violating our national interests, then we follow an independent foreign policy. It's that easy. So what's happening, for example, in the Syrian file, in northeast of Syria, is a clear example of this. And all these S-400s issue is also going back to this difficulty between Turkey and the US. I hope we can find a middle way, because it's an important relationship in our larger ties with the West. However, especially with Britain and the soundness of the relationship is actually a great contributor to the larger Turkey-Europe relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.